you can cut spending, you can raise taxes. But I would say that the wealthy are definitely undertaxed relative to the general population.
That was Warren Buffett yesterday speaking to Becky about the nation's tax system. Joining us right now is former U.S. Representative Jeb Hensarling and former U.S. Congressman and CNBC contributor Barney Frank. I had an article in the New York Times that ran yesterday discussing this very topic. Over the past couple months, I had consulted with some tax accountants, lawyers, executives, and politicians, trying to get some ideas to plug the gaps in the tax code. But my idea was to try to do it without blowing it apart. I suggested trying to patch the estate tax and increase capital gains and some real estate loopholes and fixed carried interest. And we wanted to get your thoughts on where you think all of this should go, which is to say, is there a way to do this? And I'll start with you, Jeb Hensarling. Is there a way, and I know you don't want to raise taxes, but do you believe that there are some inequities in the tax system that should be fixed?
Well, I think the tax code can always be made fairer, flatter, simpler. I have co-sponsored the fair tax, which would absolutely get rid of the income tax and get rid of all the various exclusions and loopholes. Obviously, that is a long step to take. But, you know, I question, what are we trying to do here? I mean, the ink is still barely dry, perhaps a year old, on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Nothing is more fair than 3% economic growth versus 1.7. Nothing is more fair than having the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, greatest wage gains in 10 years. So I ask, what are we trying to do here? You know, we do need to make the tax code more fair. I'm glad in the last Tax Cut and Jobs Act, 42 different loopholes were taken out. I'm sure more could be taken out. But what is our purpose? Are we just going to use the money to fund some aspect of the new Green Deal, to take away people's cars and their employer health insurance? Is this about being punitive to successful people? I mean, where I see the most billionaires is where I see the greatest standard of living for the working poor. And so I don't want to do that. Now, if this is about making the tax code fairer, flatter, and simpler by removing more loopholes, I'm all into it. If we're going to raise more revenue and we pair that with spending discipline, I'm all in for that as well. But right now, we've got something that's working for the American people.
Barney, take that on, though, because there is a philosophical distinction taking place in the Democratic Party, it seems, about exactly why they want to raise taxes. There are some on one end who want to raise taxes, it seems, to raise revenue. There's another that I have to say feels maybe more punitive in regard to inequality and the idea of taking it away from people as part of a redistribution effort.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, that that latter group, particularly in the most extreme form, their role in the Democratic Party has been exaggerated. Whether it's the Green New Deal or tax rates that go up into 70 and 80%, they are not representative of the majority of Democrats. What you have is a solid majority of Democrats, which would include these people, who do think we need to raise revenue. And here I would differ with Jeb. And apparently the Republicans in Congress and the president also would seem to think we need more revenue, because what Jeb left out of his catalog were the enormous deficits that have been growing. Now, I am not one who has been terribly concerned about the economic impact of deficits within the right context, if you're spending the money for investments, for example. But the fact is that we are not now producing the revenue that ought to be there to support the level of activity that's going on. And I talked about this the last time I was on, Andrew, infrastructure. There is a universal agreement that we need a substantial increase in funding for infrastructure. Nothing would better improve the productivity of the country than a significant improvement of the infrastructure that lets people and goods move more quickly. But we can't afford it right now. The president promised it. It's one of his promises that has gone absolutely nowhere. I think it is also the case that, yes, we got 3% growth because of a very, very great dose of Keynesianism. The Republican Congress and President Trump gave John Maynard Keynes the best endorsement of his approach that we've ever seen. And the result was, in the short term, some growth. But there is no sign that that 3% is being sustained going forward. as it would have been if this was really a boost to long-term
Congressman
investment.
Frank, I'm sorry, just to go back on the infrastructure. The reason that's gone nowhere is because Democrats and Republicans can't agree on how to dole out that money, whether it should be private, public, what sort of environmental standards it should be held to. We've heard this debate go on for a long time. Everybody says they're in favor of infrastructure, but when it comes down to the details, nobody can agree.
Well, there is a fight over environmental, but the first point you made is exactly my point, private-public. You cannot do much of the needed infrastructure with private funds. With private funds, you can do toll roads. You can do things that will pay back. But much of the infrastructure has to come from public money, from a very large amount of public money. And the starting problem is that there is no commitment to spending that degree of public money. The president wants to do it, he says, with all private money, and there's no way that you do a lot of the repair that we need, as well as the new construction, without government money.
Jeb, I never viewed you as such a big Keynesian. So you love that tax plan. When did you turn into such a big Did you know what you were voting for? Did you know that it was a big Keynesian stimulus?
By the way, not just the tax cut.
I would enthusiastically do it again today because, again, one of the ways that we deal with the deficit, one of the ways we deal with the deficit is obviously economic growth. All we need to do, if we can maintain 3% economic growth, this is tax relief that more than pays for itself. I was also interested in Barney saying that somehow this Green New Deal is all about outlier Democrats. Well, it just so happens that every major candidate for the Democrat presidential nomination has paid homage to this radical Green New Deal that it's going to cost American families over $620,000 at the last estimate that I saw. And so there's certainly nothing fair about that. And getting back to taxes, listen, we ought to have a debate about what is fair, but we ought to also have the facts. And the facts are the top 1% of wage earners are paying roughly 40% of the income taxes. The top 5% of wage earners are paying over 60% of the income taxes.
But can we agree that represents
Barney, their income?
Question. Barney, your response?
Yeah. Well, first of all, that represents their share of the income. But the other point is that this 3% would be wonderful. There is no sign that this is anything more than a short-term boost. And by the way, my talk about Keynesianism was not just the big tax cut, but the large expenditure increase. It was a combination of the two, and that there was a very big, under the Republicans, a big expenditure increase when they controlled the Congress. So the point that I
understood you correctly, Barney, but you're wrong. You know, the 1% makes roughly 24% of the income, but pay 40% of the taxes. So it's not one-on-one parity to begin with. Second of all, 3% economic growth. 3% economic growth is simply the average of the post-war era. All we're trying to do is rid ourselves of the legacy of Obama.
But that's not where we are now, Jeb. All right. Let me respond. First of all, you're arguing contradictorily. First of all, you're saying 3% is the post-World War II average, but then you're also claiming that it was the tax cut that you voted for that caused it. It can't be both. If it's the norm,
then actually it can be. It's what helped bring us back. It's a significant legislative item that brought us back.
Jeb, you're not neither one of us is the chairman anymore, so neither one of us can tell the other one to stop talking and interrupt. The fact is that we are no one thinks we're going forward with the 3%, that this was a short-term boost, but that no one is projecting 3% going forward. And the notion that the tax cut was going to pay for itself has clearly not been the case. It is falling far short of making even the more income.
I understand that you and other Democrats buy in. I understand you and other Democrats buy into this narrative of secular stagnation that somehow the gods deign that we can have 2% economic growth. Well, it's because we had bad tax policy. It's because we had bad regulatory policy. And with good tax policy and good regulatory policy, yes, once again, America's capable of 3% economic growth.
You're making stuff up. Nobody mentions secular stagnation.
I'm making up 3% economic growth.
Please stop interrupting. Jeb,
I hate to say
I have
to be the chairman of this committee
I never
this morning.
mentioned secular stagnation.
We need to cut off both of you, but we do want to thank you for the conversation, and we want to do it again. So we'll bring you back and hope to continue this, we'll call it a discussion, a very friendly discussion.